Welcome to the AFR Saints channel, where we provide you daily content on your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to leave your comments below and smash that like button. Hudak. Saints beat the Chargers on Sunday. They're 2-0 in the preseason. Our friend Maddy Hudak popped on the film, put on her scouting cap, and did a little film study for us, and is good enough to join us now to tell us what she saw. Maddy, we always appreciate it. How are you?
I'm doing better. I've done better. It kind of feels like they beat the Chargers in spite of themselves, and watching the film a fifth and sixth time really only drove that point home.
Okay, so what stood out the most that made you roll your eyes or go, ugh?
I mean, anyone that was watching it live, just the amount of penalties, I'm sure that's been talked over to death, but it's the holding penalties and the false starts and just driving the offense, quite literally backwards. The majority of those penalties coming from that backup O-line that we saw out there, and their play wasn't that strong, and the amount of penalties that they incurred. And then I learned that, 2-point conversions are apparently a lot more risky to the previous touchdown than I guess I had realized. But just talk about some costly penalties for, Jay Kaner, who should have had something like 17 points by the end of that drive.
So with respect to the penalties, one of the things that I said yesterday was most of the guys that committed the penalties, Maddy, aren't going to make this team, so I'm not really going to overreact to it. Was there anything in particular that you would take away? Like, is that a sign of a lack of discipline? Anything like that? What else would you take away from that?
But probably not. I think kind of where you're at, where some of those guys aren't going to make the team, but some of those guys kind of are that backup on the O-line. And, besides Trevor Penning out there, it was mostly a bunch of guys that, I'm familiar with the name Storm Norton and Calvin Throckmorton, who I think got injured in that game. But, those are guys that could easily have to step in a game setting, just the fact that they're already down their starting guard. James Hurst moved there. Yeah, and then I'm not sure what the depth is behind Trevor Penning at left tackle either. So it kind of begs the question, and a lot of the quarterback play was hard for me to ignore. I hadn't really heard of Garcia, who they had at center, and that to me is just kind of the start and end of the offense.
Yeah. I know Max Garcia was the guy that they brought in at some point in the offseason, who it looks like he struggled a bit. But I do want to talk about Trevor Penning since you brought him up. The one time that the TV broadcast really spot shadowed him was where he whiffed on a block, which led to a TFL. What did you see from Trevor Penning in week 2 of the preseason?
That's kind of why people go and watch the film afterwards, because that broadcast view just kind of did him no favors at all. And it is kind of obnoxious to watch games like that in real time, because when you go back and you look at the film, he held his own for a majority of the time, both in run blocking and pass play, to the point where I kind of am almost walking back from my initial criticisms, just looking at this game, because, again, that view, I think, can really just skew you. I just think back to when I thought that, Ryan Ramczyk was perhaps backsliding a little bit, and then looking closer, it seemed like it was more of the play of Ruiz at guard, who at the time hadn't really kind of caught on yet, that was kind of throwing him off. And so it's hard for me to ignore that he's been on the first team with, an entirely different line than what he was with out there, and to think that wasn't affecting him whatsoever. But it was better than I thought off the top of my head, and especially the fact that he really played no actual game snaps last year, and you can only develop so much in the classroom.
That is really encouraging. It's why we obviously asked the question. So flip over to the defensive side, Maddy. The one guy that I've been asked about the most since Saturday was Niko Lalos, who had 3 sacks in the game. I mean, he was the defensive standout. First of all, what did he do that allowed him to have that type of game on Sunday?
I'm glad I went back and watched the film, because, he went literally insane at the end of that game. But, he was in as early as the start of the third quarter, and you could kind of see the same traits showing up that were kind of showing up at the end of the game. I've been, in this scouting academy course, and I watched the defensive line film with the scouting director, and I remember him using this phrase of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And breakfast being that get off, lunch being kind of the middle of the play, and then do you have that ability to finish? To me, he was showing up in all 3 phases on every single snap that he played. He seemed to have good gap integrity, have the ability to read the backfield pretty well, and have some good moves off the edge, an actual pass rush arsenal. If nothing else, I'm kind of at this point looking at him as they're running so much base defense at this point, over 25%, I think, in the first 2 games. And if they're going to keep using Zach Bond off the edge in the way he does, I know that he's technically a defensive lineman, but he's almost kind of built like that hybrid role like you'd see out of Zach Bond. And he was disruptive enough that I'm curious to see more out of him next week. But it was really kind of from the earlier reps where you could actually see those things really be continual for 2 quarters.
Maddy, do they have a roster spot for another defensive end, considering we know 4 guys are making the team? Do they have a roster spot for a 5th?
The roster projection thing is always kind of a nightmare. I think he's probably one of those practice squad guys, but I just keep thinking again, I'm probably one of the more cynical watch out for injuries on the trenches people that there are out there at this point. But, you have probably Isaiah Foskey making the roster, but has he stood out that much? Not necessarily from what you want to see out of a second round pick. I also think that a lot of the time there are expectations that might not happen in 1 or 2 preseason games and could take a little bit of time for guys to get really their heads wrapped around the NFL. Kind of like you saw Jake Haener have that almost night and day performance in game 1 versus game 2. But I would try to kind of protect him on the practice squad if nothing else. But I'm curious to see how he performs in the 3rd preseason game, because I do think that there is a certain amount up for grabs, and he certainly demanded attention on Sunday night.
Maddy Hudak's with us on Twitter at Maddy Hudak _94. By the way, somebody texted the show last week after you were on, and they were like, I'm so disappointed when I realized her name wasn't Hudat. No, it's Hudak, Hudak, Maddy, Hudak, Hudak, not Hudat. But the similarities are actually a lot of fun. Since you brought up Isaiah Foskey, he and Bryan Bresee, neither of them recorded a stat in the first preseason game. Both were a little more present. What did you see from the 2 rookie defensive linemen?
Yeah, so they were thankfully in on some reps together, so I was able to kind of watch them at the same time. The thing with Bryan, is it Bresee or Bresee?
They say Bresee. He says Bresee, Bryan Bresee.
We'll go with that. He plays on the interior, and those guys a lot of the time are taking on double teams, and if nothing else, trying to penetrate and get a little disruption in the backfield, but that's going to show up a lot less on the stat sheet than someone rushing off the edge like Isaiah Foskey. And you can see, I go back to that breakfast, lunch, dinner kind of thing. I wanted to see a little more dinner out of Bryan Bresee at the beginning of the game, but thinking about the fact that he was taking on a decent amount of double teams, that is a little bit exhausting. And he kind of showed that he has a pass rush arsenal that isn't just speed. He has some power out there as well. That's also something I wanted to point out about Niko Lalos, is he was regularly shoving off linemen with his hands alone and able to do that multiple times. And that's really rare. Isaiah Foskey doesn't know where to put his hands. And it just kind of looks like he's trying to figure out what the play is, if it's a run or a pass, where it's going. And, you just see linemen put their hands right in his breastplate and just completely clamp him up. And then he doesn't really have the power to be able to shake that off. So having better awareness that you're stepping right into a block and your hands are completely by your side, it's coachable, but it's still definitely more of a project situation. Whereas Bresee, to me, I think that, again, he's kind of fallen victim to interior, not really having a stat sheet to show for it. That doesn't mean that they're not freeing up space for the defensive ends to make plays like that Peyton Turner strip sack that Bresee ultimately recovered afterwards.
Maddy, last one for you here. Jalen Smith, we got to see him for the first time. He certainly looked the part. What did you see?
He certainly looks the part. You saw him in coverage, just really, again, for joining this team this quickly. Zone defense is the same on every single team, but the first time he made a play on that tackle, he stayed in his zone. He was reading the backfield well, and there's this term called click and close, and it's the idea of whether or not you can read the play and then actually make one. Because you could see guys out there that can diagnose a play and then just take a horrible angle, or you see Isaiah Foskey is extremely fast and he has the athletic ability, but it doesn't seem like he's able to see the plays in his head. You saw him put that together so quickly on that play, and when he was covering, he kept his eyes on the quarterback, and just those really good fundamentals that it made you feel almost entirely different about that linebacker room heading into the season, with the idea that he's definitely credible enough to fill in for that role while Demario Davis is coming back. And then again, with that base defense they've been running, perhaps he's regularly out there as that third linebacker.
She is Maddy Hudak on Twitter at Maddy Hudak _94. Give her a follow there. Saints correspondent during training camp and throughout the season. Maddy, we always appreciate it. Thanks for the time and the insight.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
All right, be well. It is after further review. We always appreciate a couple of minutes there from Maddy. Good. most importantly, I'm encouraged by what she said going back and watching the film with regard to Trevor Penning. And how she said it, I think, is completely appropriate, where when you're watching the game cut real time, sometimes it doesn't do guys justice. Like, you see the result of the play and you think, oh, man, well, Trevor Penning got beat. And he did on one play, which resulted in a TFL. But if that's like the only time you really spot shadow or see, it's the lasting takeaway that you have. Well, what do you do the rest of the game? So that he actually performed and maybe graded better than we thought, I think is a very good thing, because they need, I'm going to say this again, over and over again, they need Trevor Penning to be the starting left tackle. You have a first-round draft pick invested in him. He's got to be a starter for you. So, yeah, he basically took a redshirt year as a rookie. He's got to be that dude this year. So, very good to see that or to hear. It actually maybe outperformed what many of us have thought to this point. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact. And be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.